Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Tuesday. It is the 11th day of March in the year 2014, and I'm saying that basically in case people pick up an archived copy of the program today. And it is a pleasure to be with you, and I really mean that. It is the second day in our week, and I look forward to spending some time with you, and I look forward to hearing from some of you. We spent a little bit of time yesterday on foreign policy. I want to spend a little bit more. There are a lot of issues. I'm collecting and accumulating quite a pile of issues once we get off this, but I don't want to get off it until we finish it, if that makes sense. Bob and I were talking about a speech that Dianne Feinstein delivered on the floor of the United States Senate today that is really getting some attention in the media. I looked at the Washington Post and the New York Times about an hour ago. And the fact that she has been such a supporter of America's foreign policy initiatives. She's been a big supporter of spying. She's been a big supporter of the CIA. She's been a defender of the NSA program. And talked about, has talked about the need in today's world for having an effective foreign policy and spying apparatus and all the rest of it. So the fact that she would give the speech that she did on the floor of the United States Senate today is pretty important. And it's going to be interesting to see how President Obama responds, because very honestly, Dianne Feinstein is one of his biggest supporters in the United States Senate. There are a number of other members of the Senate who have had serious questions about some of the things we're doing, the use of drones and many of other things. And one of his pretty much loyal supporters has been Dianne Feinstein. So anyway, the speech that she gave today, which is a release of some secret documents about some of the practices, the interrogation practices engaged in by the CIA, which she blatantly called torture today, and the fact that the CIA is in part sitting on the Senate's report on this. It claims that there are some issues with it that they have questions about, but the fact of the matter is what they're really doing is sitting on it. And she basically put the pressure on them today to release it to the public so that we can begin about looking at this and finding ways to make sure that these kinds of things don't happen again. So again, the real issue, and I know there are a number of people out there, and I've already talked to a few who believe that in today's world you got to do what you got to do, so to speak. But at the same time, there is the issue of, for lack of a better term, hypocrisy. The argument, it becomes very, very uncomfortable when you talk one way and behave in another. It becomes very embarrassing. I know we had that historically with the issue of slavery in the early history of this nation. It was so difficult to climb aboard and talk in a very positive, very optimistic way about Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and all that it implied about the value of human life and every individual in society and in the world and all the rest of it, and then at the same time practice an institution, as we were practicing slavery during that same period. So, again, it seems to me that when the issue of hypocrisy is associated with something as major as this, it becomes a little bit more difficult to deal with and a little bit more difficult to justify. So it's going to be very interesting to watch that. But anyway, and let me just say before we go off that, and I want to make sure I give phone numbers and various other things. but while it's on my mind, before we go off that for the moment, Senator Feinstein raised some serious constitutional issues associated with this program, and she listed 3 specific areas where this policy, this program of the CIA's might in fact violate the Constitution, violate separation of powers, in part because there's some evidence she claims to have that the CIA was actually spying on Congress, members of Congress. And one of the most interesting things is to look at the comments to the article. I looked at it in the New York Times, and I looked at some of the comments. And, of course, the comments are, why in heaven's name would anybody spy on Congress when Congress doesn't do anything and doesn't know anything and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all they are is a bunch of hacks and all this stuff. So that much of the negativism in terms of popular attitudes towards Congress, towards the Senate, came out in the course of this. But the fact of the matter is violation of separation of powers, violation of the Fourth Amendment. There are a number of possibilities here that make this issue directly related to our mission here at the Virtual Center. So I don't want to, you know, while we leave it, I don't want to leave it permanently because I don't think we can afford to do that. Anyway, let me welcome you to today's program. If you listen to today's program, yesterday's program, then I can kind of tell you that I'd like to pick up a little bit, maybe do a little bit of review, and then go on a little, you know, from where we were yesterday, because I think this is very, very significant stuff. Again, it's not anything that people don't know, although it might be a little bit different spin on it. And sometimes just looking at things a different way helps us understand them a little bit better. Sometimes they were very complex and confusing one way, but when you look at them another way, they seem to make a little bit more sense. So with that, let me first of all welcome you and invite you to participate actively in our program, either via email or by picking up the phone and give us a call. If you'd like my email address and you'd like to communicate directly with me that way, then by all means I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, BRIEN, 906@gmail.com. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. Did receive an email from one of our listeners, Jack in Louisiana, and was talking a little bit about our conversation in previous programs about education and about different kinds of education for different populations. And specifically, he sent me he copied and pasted a copy from his local paper down there of Governor Bobby Jindal's State of the State speech, in which he kicked off the 60-day legislative session, which is just beginning now in Louisiana and will end sometime in June. I found that very interesting because here in West Virginia, this is the last week of our 60-day legislative session, which began right after the first of the year, and our governor's State of the State message was early in January. So, you know, one of the things about having a 60-day legislative session is that as you get close to the end, you become a little bit nervous because you're afraid at the very end all this bad stuff is going to happen. It's very, very interesting because in some of the previous years here, in talking to people, you kind of get the feeling that when the legislature finally adjourns and goes out of session, there's this collective sigh of relief that, God, we escaped again, you know. And although this time the legislature here in West Virginia has already passed an abortion, a piece of abortion legislation, which is an abortion, to make a little bit of the play on words itself, which makes abortion in the state illegal after the 20th week of pregnancy. And of course many people I've talked to who are really concerned about this and upset about this. And again, I haven't gone into it in any detail. There is the whole question of whether the legislature ought to be passing legislation related to any of this stuff anyway, as if it's their business. But predominantly male legislature, et cetera, et cetera. It's men telling women how to live their lives and what to do and what they should do and what they shouldn't do and how they should do it. Which is interesting because that's kind of what we're into in foreign policy as well, but we'll get to that in a moment. Many people have also commented that if a pregnancy is taken rather lightly, and of course many of the people who were proposing this legislation argued that some people use abortion as a way because they just don't want to be pregnant, and they don't want to bring a life into the world and all that stuff. So for them, abortion is a form of birth control, and taking it very lightly. And many people have pointed out to me, people who look at pregnancy that way are not inclined to carry the fetus for 20 weeks. When you get somebody that goes beyond 20 weeks of a pregnancy and abortion becomes an issue, it's usually because something bad is happening or is going to happen. That by the time a woman carries a child for 20 weeks, the only time that abortion would be taken seriously, it would seem to many of the people that I've talked to, that it would be, it would not be something that they would want to do, but something they would have to do. And the legislature here has taken away that option. So in a sense, the general gist of 2 or 3 people that I've talked to about it suggest that what we're dealing with is we're punishing the wrong people. I mean, the people that are going to be hurt most by this legislation, are the very people that the legislature claimed to be helping, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, it's a very, very controversial issue, but for me, it pretty much speaks to so far. It's the first major piece of legislation coming out of this session, other than some of the minor things that have been passed earlier. And so as far as I'm concerned, it's so far there's one strike on this legislative session. So far they've taken on one major issue and they blew that one. So anyway, but be that as it may, I'd like to go back to the issue of foreign policy today, and let me begin with just share with you a little piece of information. I took one of the documents that I'm going to be using today to class with me this morning. I teach, as many of you know, for better than 20 years. I've been teaching a class of on Tuesday mornings of senior citizens here in our local Shepherd Center, which is a once-a-week meeting of community senior citizens here. And they've been meeting for years and years. And I've been doing this class every week for 20 years, and but more than 20 years. And I used to refer to it as a class I teach for senior citizens, but in the process I've become one, so I don't really know whether that is accurate anymore, because it kind of makes me look like I'm trying to deny that I also am a senior citizen. But anyway, we got into some of this stuff this morning, and I have to tell you that at the end of class, 2 or 3 members of my class were very, very outspoken in the fact that they found this to be very, very enlightening and very, very helpful to them. As one person said, I can't believe the whole history of American foreign policy in 1 hour. Well, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but I appreciated it just the same. And this stuff is I really think is quite significant. One of the things that I would say that I didn't mention yesterday, before we actually get back into this again, is that there's probably less and less information available within the general public about American foreign policy than anything else. Americans know less about the world and about America's relationships in the world than they know almost anything else, about almost anything else. And traditionally, that's been painted as a fault of the American people. In other words, the information's out there, if people haven't chosen to focus on it and to learn it at all, then shame on them, because it's been out there, nobody's intentionally doing it. It's just the fact that people are not willing to take the time to focus on issues that are really important to them, in spite of the fact that they don't seem to realize it. But the fact of the matter is, it's not quite that simple. It's easy to blame the victim, so to speak. But the fact of the matter is, there has been in our society a conscious effort on the part of officialdom, on the part of government, traditionally, to downplay foreign policy as a subject worthy of investigation and study. I've mentioned in the past here at the Virtual Center, and I'll make mention of it again because I think it's really important, that whereas most major universities, as part of their academic offerings, used to feature a faculty position, at least one faculty position, in the area of foreign policy, American foreign policy. Over the last 30 or 40 years, as these positions have become vacant through retirements or deaths of faculty members, more often than not, they have not been replaced. And so consequently, what you find is that some of the most prominent and prestigious history programs in the country in terms of higher education do not have a foreign policy expert in their faculty, on their faculty. And the argument is that in order to try to save money and streamline their offering and all the rest of it, that was one argument that you frequently heard about reasons for not replacing a foreign policy expert with another one. The second reason frequently given is there aren't that many people out there who are qualified to fill a faculty chair in foreign policy. Because in our graduate programs, there has been less and less emphasis on diplomacy, on foreign policy, as an academic major for graduate students. There have been fewer and fewer PhDs in American foreign policy over the last 25 or 30 years than almost in any other discipline. So consequently, many universities argue we didn't replace this position when she died or retired because we couldn't find anybody who was qualified to replace that person. And consequently, they blame the graduate programs for it. When in fact, many of the graduate programs, it seems like we're experiencing a little bit of pressure to not fill those positions. There seems to be within the nation as a whole a consensus that has emerged in government circles that the less the general population knows about foreign policy, about American foreign policy, the better off we are, meaning government. In other words, there's a lot about our foreign policy that our citizens are better off not knowing about. And I find that very significant in a society based, in a republic based on the idea of the people's right to know. I find that one particularly difficult to get my arms around. And so consequently, the fact that graduate schools programs have been turning out fewer and fewer foreign policy majors in recent years, I would suggest, is in part the responsibility of the graduate programs, but not totally. And one of the things that I've realized over the years is that whereas institutions like the University of Wisconsin used to look for people like William Appleman Williams and Thomas McCormick and some of the major foreign policy names in the field in previous years, they aren't doing that now. And I know, for example, that when William Appleman Williams left Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, he left to go to the Northwest and accepted a faculty position at the University of Oregon. And at the time, I couldn't understand why Williams would want to go that route, except that many people have suggested that he was working towards his retirement, that's the part of the world he wanted to, the nation he wanted to retire in, and he went back to his home country, and that's where he wanted to finish his active career, was in the Northwest, and he was able to do that. And for a long time I accepted that. But the reality is that if you look at American history during the 50s, especially during the 60s and 70s, when you look at the demonstrations that emerged on the nation's campuses surrounding the Vietnam War, as well as the Civil Rights Movement, you begin to detect clear evidence that many institutions of higher learning were somewhat uncomfortable with the role that some of their faculty members were playing in these demonstrations. I know because I was at the University of Wisconsin. And I know that William Appleman Williams was not the only historian there who was involved in student demonstrations based on foreign policy. Some of the big names in the department at that university during that period, and I'm probably making a mistake by naming a few because there'll be others that I won't name, but I mentioned Thomas McCormick, who was kind of a student of Williams and continued in the same vein, continued writing and doing research in the same vein as Williams. But in European history, for example, one of the names that I very, very well remember was Harvey Goldberg, who was an expert on the French Revolution. And he was very active because he would take some of his research and some of the scholarship that he engaged in his research and writing about the French Revolution and transpose it into America's foreign policy role in the 1960s and 1970s, and he became a very, very popular voice at not only Wisconsin but other major universities that were experiencing anti-Vietnam demonstrations of one sort or another. And you had a number of European historians there as well. But the point I'm making is that there seems to have been a pattern during that period that those historians who focused on American foreign policy as a discipline, as a major, as a focus of their study and their research, tended to be very activist. And so consequently, there seems to me, at least, and this is just an observation, there seems to be something connecting these points, that as universities became less and less inclined to replace these people as they retired, the history of the 1960s and the activism of these faculty members seems to me to have played a role, at least, if not being a major factor, at least a role in decisions to not replace these positions. And I think when you realize that there seems to be a general consensus among officialdom in the United States, there seems to be a general idea that the less most citizens know about foreign policy, the better off we are. When you realize that, and then you look at what's happened, and you look at the activism of some of these foreign policy historians and political scientists in this area, it seemed like there was an awful lot that was surfacing in the study of American foreign policy that drove those who researched it to become activists. And so therefore, the fact that it would become less and less popular as a discipline and fewer faculty members would hold positions in these areas seemed to me, at least, to become fairly important and fairly significant. It's extremely difficult to replace somebody like William Appleman Williams. I know that. But the fact of the matter is, people didn't go out of the way. Instead, what many departments did is begin to hire historians in other fields. Europe, of course, the big thing in the 60s and 70s was Asia, and Asian history, and history departments began to put on a number of Asian experts. For a while it was Soviet experts It was Russian history experts. But then as we became much more involved in the Far East and the issue of China going communist in 49 and all that came out of that, the prominent role that China played increasingly in the world in the late decades of the 20th century, meant that we had more Sino-historians, more experts on Chinese history and Chinese culture and that kind of thing. And so consequently, American foreign policy kind of began to become less and less visible. And I think there's a story there. I really do. And so I'm very interested in it. But I'm also aware that even if you read the press around the world, people in newspapers throughout Europe and Asia will say straight up that the American people know less about foreign policy than almost any people in the developed world. We have tended to believe what we've been told rather than focus on understanding and knowing it for ourselves. The other thing, and Bob and I had a conversation, Bob Kincaid and I, about this. We don't do particularly well internationally with our foreign policy anyway. Many of the people that we appoint to diplomatic positions are obviously accomplished in the fields of diplomacy, but unfortunately many of them are not. We know, for example, that traditionally most administrations, whether they be Democrat or Republican, it really doesn't matter, have usually used ambassadorships as a way to reward major contributors and supporters of their particular campaigns and their political party. We haven't tended to appoint the most competent people necessarily to diplomatic posts around the world, but rather the most loyal folks. And I don't know whether that's changing or not, because if you remember that there was a lot of controversy in the consternation between Democrats and Republicans in the United States Senate about approving many of President Obama's recommendations for appointment to diplomatic posts. One of the recent ones, of course, was Caroline Kennedy in Japan. And you may remember that there was some controversy about that. And I'm not in any way suggesting that Caroline Kennedy is not competent to hold that post. But the fact of the matter is, for a long time, there has been this sense that we're sending people over there that that are as likely to embarrass us as they are to help us. And I'm struck by the movie that became very prominent in the 1950s called The Ugly American, and how many times that has become true, where these people are supposed to be ambassadors representing the United States in relations between us and that particular country, and instead create some sort of international embarrassment for the nation and for the president and various other things. Because many times these people they're there because of what they've done and what they've contributed, not because of what they know and what they can do. And so I think this is an area. But when you combine that with what the American people don't know, and then you combine it with the decline in the number of professionals who make diplomacy their focus of research and study, you begin to get a sense that there seems to be a desire on the part of most administrations when they come into office, it doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democrats, to bring with them the people who are going to call the shots in our foreign policy, rather than to trust the people out in the field who are giving us feedback and information. I remember, some of you may remember, the lead up to the Iraq War in the early 21st century. You remember the invasion, the war against Iraq began with the shock and awe campaign in March of 2003. Well, in the lead up to that, if you remember, we had an ambassador over in Iraq, and some of the information that was coming back and some of the information that has surfaced about the behavior of our diplomats over there and the fact that they were there passing out packages of money and all this other stuff. I mean, you begin to get a sense that that our in diplomacy was in disarray and dysfunction for a large part of this period. And I guess what I'm saying is that's not necessarily new. So, point of the story is, I really believe that this topic that we are pursuing this week, that we started yesterday and will continue with today, I really think that this is significant for a lot of other reasons. I also realize that those who tune in and regularly participate in the Head-On Radio Network are probably more knowledgeable and more aware of what's going on in the world than the average citizen. So many of the things that I've said over the last 15 to 20 minutes probably don't apply as much to the audience that we have here as it would to the citizenry at large in this country. Be that as it may, I'm hoping that some of the things that we are able to do here over the, yesterday and today will be valuable and will be helpful. As I mentioned yesterday, and again, I have to give credit where credit is due here. This is not my claim. This is the claim of William Appleman Williams. And his position was, and I have found it to be true, that if you really understand some of the ingredients of American foreign policy as he looked at it, and you begin to understand what we're about and why we do what we do and why we really have to do some of the things we do, then you can take that information and use it to predict what we will do in the future. Because the fact of the matter is, many of these things don't change. And so consequently, the very foundational principles of America's foreign policy priorities, as developed through the years, remain intact. And that means that, depending on the particular international situation that happens to arise, chances are we're going to do what we have to do because of these foundational principles. So consequently, if you understand those principles, you can predict in almost any situation what our options will be and what our final decisions will be, because to be very honest with you, we really don't have that much of a choice. So consequently, understanding the basis of those principles seems to me to be critical in terms of what we know and how we respond to events in the future. The big event right now is obviously the Ukraine situation. And one of the things that we talked about this morning with senior citizens was the extent to which they felt that they understood what was going on in Ukraine a lot better after our meeting today than they did before it. And I found that to be quite encouraging. So with that, let's go back to some of these principles that we talked about yesterday. And again, let me begin by quoting or paraphrasing William Appleman Williams, who made the point that if you understand the principle of the open door as it was implemented, refined, and defined in the late 19th century, and what we're talking about here is 1898, 1899, and 1900, if you understand the idea of the open door and the ramifications of that program, of that policy, of that way of looking at the world, William Appleman Williams said, you will understand all you need to know about American foreign policy, what we did and why we did it, but not only that, also what we will do and why we will do it. So again, if you'll bear with me for a little bit of review about the open door, and I'm not going to go through a lot of the history, but I'll focus mainly on the policy itself. If you remember, at the end of the 19th century, when the United States is engaged in its first major international event, if you will, of its history. And again, I'm aware of the Monroe Doctrine in the early 19th century. I'm aware of the incursions, the war with Mexico in the mid-19th century. I'm aware of the diplomacy associated with Lincoln's prosecution of the Civil War in the 1860s. In other words, it's not like we didn't have any foreign policy prior to this time. But the real major issue in American foreign policy really happens with the Spanish-American War in 1898. And what makes that particular event significant is, in part at least, the realities of the Industrial Revolution and the extent to which America's expansion overseas, not physically, but commercially and economically and diplomatically, almost mandated that the United States seriously consider issues associated with becoming an imperial power. As offensive as Americans, we as students, as offensive as we find the term imperialism, the fact of the matter is what we're talking about here is imperialism. Today, and Bob Kincaid and I were making reference to this earlier before we went on the air today, one of the historians that some of you may remember because we had him on our PRISM grant program twice, and that's Jeremy Surrey, who's a diplomatic historian at the University of Texas. Kind of contradicts what I said about prominent history departments not employing foreign policy experts. The University of Texas is an exception, because on their staff is Jeremy Surrey, who's one of the brightest and most exciting historians to come along in a long time. And I will say that he comes from the University of Wisconsin. He was there for 10 years before he accepted a position a couple of years ago on the faculty at the University of Texas in Austin. And I was fortunate to get an introduction to him, and we invited him to participate in our PRISM grant program, and through Skype, he agreed to do that, and we had a couple of very, very exciting sessions. The book that Jeremy Surrey has written on American foreign policy that has gotten all the attention and all the awards is entitled Liberty's Surest Guardian. Let me say that again, because it's a book worth reading. Liberty's Surest Guardian. And what it is about is nation building. The extent to which American foreign policy, more than anything else, has focused on nation building throughout its history and continues to do so. I would suggest to you that nation building is a nice way of talking about imperialism. All the things that William Appleman Williams called imperialism, Jeremy Surrey calls nation building. Let me bring the two together. What makes the two synonymous is that Surrey points out in the title of his book that our successful ability to support and fund and mentor developing nations so that they will develop economic, social, and political systems like ours. Let me rephrase that or paraphrase that. The extent to which our foreign policy is successfully able to create little United States around the world in some of the developing nations who model their development on us. The more successful we are at doing that diplomatically, the greater our liberty is protected. Our security, our future, is linked to the realities of nation building. What that means is that our foreign policy is always aimed at trying to create political and economic and social systems that mirror our own. Because the reality is that nations that want the same thing we want become allies, not enemies. And the more successful we are in garnering allies, the more successful our foreign policy is, and the more secure is American freedom, as we are inclined to define it. Williams called that imperialism. And maybe the difference is, to use Bob Kincaid's term, maybe the difference is more cosmetic than real. But the fact of the matter is, it's very, very important to understand that. Because what Jeremy Surrey is writing about, and one of the most prominent points in his book, is that in his study of American foreign policy, nation building is built into the DNA of America, is his point. That's his phrase. Nation building is in our DNA. We've got to have it. We've got to do it. And the more successful we are, the more secure we are. And the more secure we are, the more protection there is for American freedom and American liberty and American priorities and American opportunities and all the rest of it. Our way of life becomes stronger the more the world contains nations whose priorities are the same as our own. And so our foreign policy from the very beginning has been directed towards creating that reality. That's pretty sophisticated stuff. It's stuff that a lot of people, a lot of citizens in this country don't know. What makes nation building as a term less offensive than imperialism? Well, the answer, it seems to me, is that when you use the term imperialism, it implies that you are doing something to somebody else against their will. You are imposing your way of life, your structure, your political system, your economic system, your social, whatever. You are opposing it on people who don't want it. Nation building implies that you have successfully reached some sort of an accord with people in other nations, governments in other nations, and they have bought into your model of development. And so therefore, together, you can work together to build their nation into a mirror of your own. Imperialism, the first, seems to be a little bit more harsh and cruel than the second, which seems to be, nation building seems to be more the product of agreement among peoples rather than disagreement. Whether, in fact, the difference is significant enough to separate and distinguish the two terms, I guess we could debate that forever. I guess we could at least debate that all day, but I don't know that it's productive to do that. So let's go back to the open door notes, because in effect, when William Appleman Williams says that if you understand the policy of the open door as refined and defined in the late 19th century, you understand everything you will ever need to know about American foreign policy. What I'd like you to think about is the extent to which these open door notes effectively define the ingredients of nation building, which is Jeremy Surrey's term. And at this point, let's not quibble over whether it's imperialism or whether it's nation building. It seems to me it depends on who you are and how critical you are of what we're doing. If you tend to be a real critic, you're going to favor imperialism over nation building. If you are liberal, if you really do believe that what we're doing may be clearly in our own self-interest, but the fact of the matter is it's in the interest of the people on the receiving end as well. So in effect, our foreign policy is a win-win. It's a win for them and it's a win for us. If you look at it that way, then nation building is much easier to handle and much more comfortable to embrace. I really think this stuff is extremely important. So again, let's go back to China in the late 19th century. As we mentioned yesterday, the industrial nations of Europe had, by the end of the 19th century, been successful in carving out what are called spheres of influence in China. Regions that they controlled militarily and economically. Their purpose was trade. Their driving force was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created a manufacturing backlog that these nations had to find markets for, as well as raw materials to continue to feed the productive machines, which was the industrial economy of these modern developing nations. And the result is the 6 major nations at this time possessed spheres of influence in China. One of those nations that I think it's important to keep this in mind is Japan. Even though Japan is an Asian nation that you would associate would be much more like China than unlike China, the fact of the matter is Japan had chose in the 19th century to embrace industrialism rather than to resist it. And so consequently, Japan became one of the exploiters rather than one of the exploited, if that makes sense. So besides Great Britain and Germany and France and Italy and Russia, Japan also had a sphere of influence in China. And the only major industrial power that didn't have a sphere in China was the United States. And the Spanish-American War, ostensibly fought over freedom for the Cubans from Spain, really became, as much as anything else, an opportunity to seize the Philippines from Spain as the prize in a war that seemed likely to happen in 1898. And with the blowing up of the Maine and Havana Harbor and all of the events that led to the war, the declaration of war with Spain, the explosion on the battleship Maine, the so-called Delhomme letter, which was a secret letter released to the press primarily by the Hearst newspapers, where the Spanish government had said some very unflattering things about President McKinley, which you don't do. Then there was all sorts of opposition and consternation about some of the things that were happening in Cuba to the Cuban people and all of that. And the fact that it was so close to the continental United States, many people believed that we couldn't afford to overlook it and ignore it. And so consequently, we really had no choice if we were going to live up to our mission as a nation, to our priorities as a people, as a free people, that we had an obligation to help the Cubans accomplish the same kinds of things that we accomplished in 1776. But meanwhile, on the other side of the world, there is the reality of an exploding commercial market in China that the United States is in danger of not having access to unless we can secure coaling stations in order to support our efforts to trade in the Orient. And so consequently, the fact that a war with Spain would lead us to the opportunity to seize the Philippines as one of the prizes of that war is very, very significant. And I mentioned yesterday the behavior of Assistant Secretary of the State Theodore Roosevelt, who on a Friday afternoon, when the Secretary went home early, issued orders to Admiral Dewey that if war indeed is declared against Spain, he was to sail the American fleet into Manila Harbor and seize the Philippines immediately. And that's what Dewey does. So consequently, America becomes a player in the Far East, commercially and industrially. And then John Hay, the Secretary of State, has to deal with the realities of the sphere of influence that our competitors in Europe and Japan hold in China. In other words, they have a distinct advantage because they're all already there in China and we're not. And it's in that context that John Hay devises the open door policy, the idea of the open door. And that is an effort to get the major nations to accept the principles of free trade within their spheres of influence as a way to create a win-win among all the industrial nations. We can all compete with each other for success in the China market. Let's all agree that we can all do business irrespective of whose sphere of influence we're in. Italy can trade in France's, France can trade in Germany's, Germany can trade in Great Britain's can trade in Russia's can trade in Japan's, and America can trade in them all. And he gets kind of a backdoor agreement to this. I will if they do, you know, if they're willing to do it, I'll do it. And so consequently, he sends out the open door notes to each of the European powers, which asks them to endorse the principles of the open door as defined in his open door letter. And that is that they must agree to the principles of free trade, and they must agree to respect the territorial integrity of China. Because China is the victim here. China is the host. And we are all looking, I'm using this word in a crude way, but I think you'll know what I mean. We are all looking for commercial opportunities in China, which means theoretically we are all feeding off of the host. The most critical thing that has to happen is that the host needs to remain whole so that the rest of us can continue to compete with each other for influence and for commercial success there. The only way that we can all win is if China remains viable. Therefore, John Hay asks the nations to commit to the idea that each of the nations would pay tariffs to the Chinese government as a way of funding the government. Of course, what the government is doing in China is keeping Chinese society peaceful and secure. So it's very obvious that this close working relationship that China has with the Western nations would be very unpopular among the Chinese people, because it would pretty quickly, pretty quickly dawn on the Chinese people that if we could get rid of all of these leeches and control our own economic development, China would be better off. And so these European nations are all contributing and agreeing to work together to make sure that kind of perspective doesn't happen. But that perspective does happen in the Boxer Rebellion. That's really what the Boxer Rebellion is a rebellion to overthrow the Manchu dynasty which is the government of China. And so consequently, the European nations create an international army that they use to help the Chinese government crush the Boxers. And then at the end of that rebellion, John Hay realizes that hostility and the desire for revenge on the part of Western nations because of the behavior and the violence associated with the Boxer Rebellion might cause nations to colonize their spheres of influence. In other words, to lock up the region of China that they controlled and to abandon their commitment to the idea of open commercial freedom and free trade and all the rest of it. And if that happened, we'd be out. So consequently, John Hay sends a second set of open door notes in early 1900, in which he asks for reconfirmation on the part of all of these nations to the principles of the open door and to their respect for the territorial integrity of China. And he gets it. And so consequently, the United States becomes a major player in the commercial future of China. And the open door policy becomes accepted fact. That's kind of where we stopped yesterday. And let me use the last couple of minutes here of this first hour before we take our break to lay the groundwork for what becomes World War I. We're in the early 1900s. We're in the early 20th century. And as we know, the security and peace of Europe begins to deteriorate during the early part of the 20th century to the point that many people are predicting the continent of Europe will end up exploding into world war. And probably the major instigator is Germany. And the reason, this is Colonel House, Woodrow Wilson's major chief advisor, the reason for this, House believes, is because Germany was so late in unifying that many of the most positive and lucrative spheres of influence, not only in China, but in Africa as well, because there's an awful lot of this going on in Africa. Consequently, the German government has become very aggressive and has seen its only option, because it has industrialized and it has such tremendous industrial potential, that it too must find markets and must find dependable sources of raw materials. And it's acting very aggressively on the international stage in order to secure these things. And so consequently, nations are forming defensive alliances against Germany. And in response to that, Germany is forming its own alliances in opposition to those. And the result is that in the early 20th century, the continent of Europe becomes a series of international secret treaties and agreements and contracts, commercial contracts or whatever, that if there's a spark, if anything sets it off, the continent will explode. And that's what happens in August of 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Austria and Hungary, two separate nations, go to war. But because of the international agreements they have, the whole continent of Europe is pulled into that war with them. And suddenly Europe is engaged in a war that nobody wanted, that nobody believed would happen, because commercially and industrially, war works against the interests of everybody. So many people believed that the world had become too civilized, too industrialized, and too educated to allow itself to fall into this abyss which would cause a world war. But lo and behold, that's exactly what we got. And the fact of the matter is, for 3 years, from 14 until 1917, Woodrow Wilson is able to keep the United States out of the war in Europe. But after his re-election in November of 1916, when Germany undertakes unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson and his administration become convinced that there's actually a possibility that the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the others, could win this thing. And if one nation became too powerful on the continent of Europe, that would violate the commercial potential of the United States in its ability to trade with Europe. In other words, the principles of the open door could not operate if one nation was in control of the continent of Europe. The only way that America's freedom and security could be preserved was when a relative balance of power existed on the continent of Europe as well as in Asia. So whenever any nation is threatening to become too powerful to the point that it would disrupt the balance of power in the world, it negatively affects the economic, industrial, and commercial future of the United States of America. Our whole way of life is directly contingent on the idea that the entire world must be kept open for expansion and opportunities in the area of commerce and industrial sales and the development, the extraction of natural resources. And so any nation that seems to be acquiring enough power to potentially threaten that principle of the open door, that reality defines America's foreign policy priorities. We must address it, and we must deal with it immediately. And so consequently, Wilson brings the United States into World War I in order to make sure that the right side wins that war. And in January of 1917, Wilson goes before the Congress of the United States and gives his very famous 14-point speech about his plan for the world after World War I. His plan to make sure that World War I would really be the war to end all wars. And so consequently, it becomes absolutely critical for us to look at the ingredients of Wilson's 14-point program. And we'll do that in our second hour. It is right now 3 minutes after the top of the hour. We're going to pause and take a brief break, 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll be back with our second hour. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you all very, very much. If you've been with us through our program today, I appreciate your willingness to stay with us. If you are just joining us, our topic is foreign policy. Our focus in this hour is going to be looking at Woodrow Wilson's plan for the post-war world in 1917, 1918. The plan, the 14-point plan that he brings to Versailles, to the peace conference at the end of World War I. And you know, we haven't really focused on the role of the United States militarily in that war, and the trench warfare and the use of chemical weapons and all of these other things that make war. And you know, obviously there's tremendous story there as well. But our purpose here is to try to get a handle around, get our arms around the priorities of foreign policy, how it's made, and what its objectives are and what its assumptions are. That's really our goal. I would love to hear from you on this topic or other topics that you might feel inclined to share with us. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, one-on-one on these issues, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I believe I mentioned at the outset of our program an hour ago that I did receive an email from a listener in Louisiana who sent me a copy of Governor Bobby Jindal's State of the State message at the opening of the 60-day legislative session in Louisiana. And in that address, and that's of course what prompted the listener to send it in, Jindal was talking about a priority being education, and specifically job-focused education. And what he wanted to do was put a lot of money into community college education for those not going to four-year institutions, as well as support for education for those headed to four-year colleges and universities as well. And the editorial makes the point that Governor Jindal kind of dodged the whole issue of the Common Core. Louisiana is one of those states that has not yet taken a position on the Common Core. And it's very obvious that Jindal's refusal to endorse the Common Core suggests that he's not very comfortable with it, and that's what we've been talking about. But anyway, prior to our break here at the top of the hour, we were looking at the outbreak of World War I and the very reluctant role the United States played as participant in that war beginning in 1917. Through the election of 1916, Wilson was able to run for re-election in November of 1916 on the campaign slogan that he kept us out of war. And Wilson, up to that point, was very successful in keeping us out of the war, and at the same time maintaining America's neutrality in the war. In other words, our insistence that we weren't at war, so consequently we ought not to suffer any of the negatives that are associated with nations at war. In other words, our ships should be immune. We ought to be able to trade with whomever we want, since we are not a participant in the conflict. And we expect all nations to respect our rights as a neutral, our rights to do business, our commercial rights. But Germany is very aware that the United States is not really behaving as a neutral. It is pouring money and munitions into the Allied war effort. And so consequently, in late 1916 and early 1917, Germany makes the decision to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare. Up to this time, we had been successful in getting Germany to minimize its use of the submarine. It's very interesting to read President Wilson and his views on submarine warfare. He finds it very, very unmanly and unfair. The fact that a nation can hide in secret under the water and can sink ships that can't even see them. He finds that to be, his view of fairness and balance is the old idea of two pirate ships in the ocean firing balls at each other. He finds submarine warfare very uncomfortable and very unfair. The fact of the matter is, Germany finds America's behavior during the war as very unfair as well, to the point that Germany finally makes the decision that whether the United States comes in or not, Germany can no longer afford to hold back on its use of the submarine, or it could lose. So consequently, Germany unleashes unrestricted submarine warfare and begins to impose blockades of the coast throughout Europe. And there's every indication in the world, at least from Wilson's perspective, that the use of the submarine could push this over the edge, over the line, and that the Central Powers, Germany and its allies, could actually win this war. And given America's priorities in foreign policy, we could not allow that. So it seems to me, at least, the way I interpret it, is when it became clear that by staying out of the war, we were probably going to be responsible for the wrong side winning it, we made the decision to go in. And in preparation or anticipation for that, Wilson lays out his 14-point program to Congress. And he basically makes the point that the reason we are going in this thing is to end it. And all through, while we are in the war, we will pursue every avenue possible to bring it to a peaceful conclusion.
Hey, Dr. Bill.
Yes, Bob.
Jim is on the line for you.
Can you repeat that?
I said Jim is on the line for you.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Bob. Hi, Jim.
Oh, good afternoon, Dr. O'Brien. How are you?
I'm great, sir. How are you?
Okay. Going back to this business about the opinions of the use of the submarine, you know, initially they did have the cruiser rules and things like that, which allowed the submarine to function as a newly evolved weapon of war.
Uh-huh.
I believe that's what they were called. And it's really hard for me to even follow Wilson's thinking on that the use of the submarine was not chivalrous. I mean, no. It was an accomplished fact. It was a very, very successful weapon. And the Germans, you know, did the best they could with what they have.
Yeah, that's true. But Wilson really believed that it was unmanly and unfair.
Well,
and it violated the rules of warfare among gentlemen. You know, and in many ways, Wilson was a very, very conservative, traditional person. And he was kind of, it seemed to me at least, and this is, and I haven't, Jim, I haven't spent a lot of time on this, but in a few of the things I have read, it seems to me that Wilson was very traditional in his thinking about what was fair and what was honest, and you know, you really had a responsibility to stand up there and fight like a man and these kinds of stuff, and he found that there was something really offensive about the advantage that the submarine gave to one side over the other. Now, of course, the question is, if it was the Allies that were employing the submarine rather than Germany, there's a question, would Wilson have felt the same way?
And well, the Allies did have subs.
Yeah, but I don't think that they were nearly as accomplished or as effective as Germany's use of them, no.
Well, Germany had a very efficient war machine, and, you know, it was an incredibly militaristic. But yet, the Kaiser, on the other hand, you know, history always portrays him as parading around with his uniforms and, of course, grabbing people by the left hand because I think his right hand was, well, deformed because of some accident at birth, and nonetheless. But the Kaiser was very progressive in many respects, as far as being able to establish unions, things of that nature, and the use of science and stuff. And I think he's really been portrayed very badly in the light of history.
I think you're right, Jim. I think you're probably right. I really do, and of course we do that. I mean, we the people we don't like, we tend to be very, very unfair to in our treatment of them, and I guess the Kaiser would fall into that category. But the detail that you talk about, I honestly am not privy to. I you know, I respect what you're telling me, and I appreciate the information.
Oh, he was quite an interesting character. He was.
I'll bet he was. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, as a matter of fact, he was Queen Victoria's grandson, and when she was dying, he insisted on going to bed and holding her and stuff like that, and then of course he was very much used to having his own way. But what I called initially before the break, I just wanted to say something about the Archduke Ferdinand, who made his end on 28 June 1914. And it's amazing how history can turn on such pivotal points. For example, when he was in Sarajevo, he was warned not to go. If his driver had taken the right way instead of having to back up and put him in line with that assassin. It's interesting to see what would happen.
History would have been changed, yeah.
He was an extremely progressive man, too, because what he wanted to do with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he wanted, instead of the dualism between, the Magyars and the Austrians, he wanted to introduce a trialism, and it was to be called the United States of Austria, and to give a lot of these people who were not content under Habsburg rule a voice in their government. And he wasn't very popular in the Austrian court because of his marriage, too, to Sophie Chotek, and theirs was a morganatic marriage. But when he was shot, and of course, the Austrian Foreign Ministry, pursued Serbia and then gave Germany that blank check. And ironically, the Kaiser at the time was on his yacht, the Meteor, when he received the news of the assassination. And of course, unfortunately, the dominoes began to fall.
Yes. Yes.
And you would think, even with Nicholas II, if only that man had simply gotten up from the table when they were mobilizing, instead of having done so, had just gone home to his family, it would have been a far different world, would it not?
I'll tell you, Jim, that's fascinating stuff. That really is. What a contribution. Thank you. You're making all of this come alive, and I think it's very important, because I guess that there are a lot of other folks out there like you who really probably know more about this. This is one of those areas that some people are very, very accomplished in reading about, study of the Kaiser, for example. And I know my friend Keith Lilly is very, very up on this kind. We used to have conversations all the time about this, because he really finds the Kaiser to be an extremely interesting person and very unfairly treated by historians, as you point out.
Well, unfortunately, those who win the war write the history.
Write the history of it. That's right. History's written by winners, not losers. And
in this case, those who won that war at this time, boy, did they really write a very, very bad 448 articles of the Treaty of Versailles.
That's right.
Because
and that's the war guilt clause.
Was treated right. War guilt, war reparations, which were beyond
beyond the ability of any nation to pay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was just a little over 20 years later, we certainly paid for that one, didn't we?
It sure did. Adolf Hitler is what we got in payment for that. Well, Jim, thank you so much.
Take care.
I do. Thank you so much. It was really a joy, and thank you for that contribution. I'm sure that folks appreciated it. What I wanted to do is spend some time looking at the ingredients of Wilson's 14-point program. I really believe that at this point we probably have an understanding, because of the treatment of the open door, the coverage of the open door, we probably have a much greater appreciation of what Wilson is asking for and why it's so important. But one of the things Wilson does in his speech of January, I think I said 1917, it's 1918, January 8th, 1918. Wilson opens his speech by laying out what he believes caused the war. Now, of course, this is all background for the peace proposal that he's going to develop, that he's going to introduce. So basically, it stands to reason that if people are going to give serious attention to the proposal he's making, then they will be very, very persuaded by the way he explains the origins of the war itself. Because naturally, Wilson's priority is to say, this is what I propose, and once you understand what caused this, you'll see why my proposal will work. So there's a distinct connection, if you will, between the early part of his speech and the 14 points that Wilson makes as the major ingredient of his speech. So very quickly, what I thought I would do is share with you the opening comments that Wilson makes before he gets into his 14 points. And some of you, if you've looked on the Internet, you can find, all you need to do is Google Wilson's 14-point program, and there are numerous copies of it there. Wilson said, "It will be our wish and purpose that the processes of peace, when they are begun, shall be absolutely open, and that they shall involve and permit henceforth no secret understandings of any kind. The day of conquest and aggrandizement is gone by. So is also the day of secret covenants entered into in the interest of particular governments, and likely at some unlooked-for moment to upset the peace of the world. It is this happy fact, now clear to the view of every public man whose thoughts do not still linger in an age that is dead and gone, which makes it possible for every nation whose purposes are consistent with justice and the peace of the world to avow nor or at any other time the objects it has in view." So Wilson opens by saying that all the ingredients, all the things that caused this war, we've got to make sure we fix. And one of them are the secret agreements and secret treaties that existed which helped bring on this war. Now, except for those who are still caught in a world that no longer exists, most of us can begin to appreciate, he says, that if we're going to do things that are consistent with justice and the peace of the world, then we've got to basically take it on and do it. Then he gets into the issues of the war itself as far as America's entry into it. We entered this war because violations of right had occurred which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible unless they were corrected, and the world secure once and for all against their recurrence. So, of course, but when he's talking about violations of right, he's talking about German use of the submarine. What we demand in this war, therefore, is nothing peculiar to ourselves. It is that the world be made fit and safe to live in, and particularly that it be made safe for every peace-loving nation which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world as against force and selfish aggression. All we want is what everybody else wants, Wilson is saying. All the peoples of the world are in effect partners in this interest. And for our own part, we see very clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. The program of the world's peace, therefore, is our program. And that program, the only possible program, as we see it, is this. And then he lays out his 14 points. So he has sketched what he sees to be the causes. And of course, to him, those causes become the justification for the 14-point program that he's going to present to address those causes. Number one, I'm not going to go through all 14, so please don't be upset. Number one, open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view. Open covenants of peace, openly arrived at. No more secret diplomacy. No more secret treaties. No more a situation where you do something and suddenly you find out you're at war with a nation that you didn't even know was involved. So now what we want after this war, to make sure we don't have another one, let's all agree, he's saying to the Allied powers, let's all agree that will be above board. Diplomacy will be in the open. Everybody will know who's dealing with whom, who has treaties, commercial treaties with whom. In other words, everybody will have an idea as to what the results would be if something would happen. And that way, because everybody knows what's going on, we're not going to blunder into another disaster like this particular war. So the first point of his 14-point program is open diplomacy, open covenants of peace openly arrived at. The second principle, absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas, outside territorial waters, alike in peace and in war, except as the seas may be closed in whole or in part by international action for the enforcement of international covenants. Nations will be guaranteed freedom to use the oceans. And the only time that access to the ocean, to the seas, will be closed off to anybody is when it serves an international action for the benefit of international agreements. In other words, when the whole world decides that the world would be better if we temporarily close free trade, suspend free trade and suspend access to the seas, we'll do it. But other than that, every nation can rest assured that its access to the oceans of the world will be guaranteed. The third point, the removal, so far as possible, of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade conditions among all nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. The removal of all economic barriers so that everybody can trade equally with everybody else. We're not going to have a world where certain nations are required to pay tariffs in order to do business while other nations are not. People have used taxes on trade, tariffs, to penalize their enemies and reward their friends. And that kind of behavior causes trouble, causes war. So what we're all going to agree on here is that as far as possible, there will be no more economic barriers and no more trade wars, no more discriminating against some for the benefit of others. Everybody will be treated the same way by everybody else. The fourth principle, the fourth point, adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. Nations will be allowed to keep arms necessary to preserve internal security, domestic security, put down rebellions, etc. But nations will voluntarily disarm when it comes to the ability to wage war. There's no way in the world, Wilson seems to be saying, that you can expect to have a world that remains at peace when certain nations within that world are arming themselves to the teeth, because it makes other nations feel insecure and unsafe. So the only way we can guarantee that people will feel comfortable and secure and safe is when they know that all the other nations have disarmed. Therefore, they pose no direct, immediate military threat. That's number 4. And number 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Basically, what he's talking about is the territorial integrity of all peoples. Translation: every people, every nationality has a right to, deserves its own nation, its own government within its own borders, with its own flag, and its own sense of national pride and patriotism. And what Wilson is implying here is that war happens when one people governs another people. When you have a situation where one nationality has power over another, you naturally get discriminatory behavior. You get unfairness in taxes and various other things. When you have a world which is made up of nations controlling other nations or peoples controlling other peoples, you're asking for trouble. So Wilson is saying what the world needs to do, what we need to do as victors in this war, is we need to sit down and absolutely from an impartial basis, we need to redraw the map of the world in such a way that as much as possible, every nationality, every people gains its own nation. And so out of this process in World War I comes the creation of many nations which have since disappeared because they've been taken over by, for example, the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The three that I'm thinking of are on the Baltic: Latvia and Lithuania, and I can't remember the third one. Anyway, the two of the three are Latvia and Lithuania. And many of the nations in what we call the Near East, Eastern Europe, Serbia, and the breaking up of the Ottoman Empire, and the rights of the Austrians to have their own nation, and the Hungarians to have their own nation, and the Turks to have their own nation, etc., etc., etc. And so what Wilson does then, after the first 5 points, beginning with point 6, he goes through Europe and makes recommendations as to which areas we need to concentrate on in terms of redrawing. So let me quickly go through these because we don't need to know these. We don't, but basically it seems to me they are examples of what he's talking about above in point 5 about the impartial redrawing of the boundaries of the world in such a way that nationalism is given its due consideration. In point 6, he says, the evacuation of all Russian territory and such a settlement of all questions affecting Russia as will secure the best and freest cooperation of all the other nations of the world in obtaining for her an unhampered and unembarrassed opportunity for the independent determination of her own political development and national policy, and assure her of a sincere welcome into the society of free nations under institutions of her own choosing. And of course, Wilson realizes that in 1917, the Tsar has been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, by Lenin, and that now international communists control a major nation of the world, Russia. And so one of the results of World War I that Wilson wants is to redraw the maps in such a way that the Russian people get their own nation so that they can become a full participant in the world of nations. He closes this point by saying the treatment accorded Russia by her sister nations in the months to come will be the acid test of their goodwill, of their comprehension of her needs as distinguished from their own interests, and of their intelligent and unselfish sympathy. The reason he addresses Russia, obviously, is because of the threat that the Bolsheviks pose to the peace of the world. So he wants all the allies to come together and restore a viable Russia. Point 7 deals with Belgium, and if you remember, the Germans overran Belgium in World War I, primarily because of where it sits. Belgium, Wilson says, the whole world will agree, must be evacuated and restored. without any attempt to limit the sovereignty which she enjoys in common with all other free nations. No other single act will serve as this will serve to restore confidence among the nations in the laws which they have themselves set and determined for the government of their relations with one another. In other words, what he's saying is the way we treat Belgium is going to give all of us a sense of a security and appreciation for what this is all about. Without this healing act, he says, the whole structure and the validity of international law is forever impaired. To him, Belgium and the way we treat Belgium becomes a key to how much faith the nations are going to have in what we're doing. So he sees the restoration of Russia and the restoration of an independent, free Belgium as being critical in order to build credibility for this program. Point 8, now he's in France. All French territory should be freed and the invaded portions restored. And the wrong done to France by Prussia in 1871 in the matter of Alsace-Lorraine, which has unsettled the peace of the world for nearly 50 years, should be righted in order that peace may once more be made secure in the interests of all. In other words, he not only wants France to be restored as an independent nation, but he also wants France to get back control over Alsace-Lorraine, which Prussian militarism had taken from France 50 years earlier. So this fits very well into Wilson's program for the idea of redrawing the maps in such a way that all the old evils and pains of the past are addressed and taken care of. Point 9 deals with Italy. The adjustment of the frontiers of Italy should be effected along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. We need to redraw Italy in such a way that nationality is given its due. Next, point 10, the other peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity to autonomous development. We have to basically recognize the national realities of the peoples of Austria and Hungary. Number 11, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro should be evacuated. Occupied territories restored. Serbia accorded free and secure access to the sea, and the relations of the several Balkan states to one another determined by friendly counsel along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality, and international guarantees of the political and economic independence and territorial integrity of the several Balkan states should be entered into. In other words, in the Balkans, we're going to do exactly what the earlier point suggests we do. Point 12, he gets to Turkey. The Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but the other nationalities which are now under Turkish rule should be assured an undoubted security of life and an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development, and the Dardanelles should be permanently opened as a free passage to the ships and commerce of all nations under international guarantees. And then the 13th point is Poland, an independent Poland. So what Wilson has done in his first 5 points is to lay out the principles around which the world will be reorganized. And then, beginning with point 6 and going through 13, he addresses specific places in the world where some of this border redrawing has to happen around the principles of territorial integrity and nationalism. And then the 14th point, which is Wilson's key point. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. The only way that nations are going to be able to feel secure buying into these points is when they know that somebody's enforcing them. No longer, World War I proves it, no longer can we trust to the goodwill of our competitor nations. Because the reality is that nations would like to violate the territorial integrity of their neighbors if they thought they could get away with it. The only way that we can expect nations to disarm and to respect each other and expect the rights of each other is when there's somebody bigger and more powerful forcing all of us to obey, to be obedient to these principles. Thus we need what, of course, we realize is a League of Nations, an international organization which will police the world and manage it according to these principles which all the member nations have agreed to by signing this treaty. There will be an enforcer, and the security of each one of us will be guaranteed by our ability to rely on the strength of all of us. If anyone breaks any of these principles, the rest of us will unite and force that nation back into line. And what that means is nations can be secure in their disarmament because they will be able to trust the international organization to enforce the rules and make sure that everybody else obeys them. Because naturally, each nation is going to be afraid, what if I live according to these things and everybody else doesn't? We're dead. So the only way you can avoid that is for people to have faith in the power of the League and the willingness of the nations who are members of the League to cooperate with each other. And that is Wilson's 14-point program. I would ask that you think seriously about the extent to which the details of this program are Wilson's effort to define the principles of the open door. Open diplomacy, access to the seas, no economic tariff discrimination among members so that everybody can rest assured that they're being treated equally and fairly by everybody else. A world that is effectively disarmed so that nations don't have to worry about their aggressive neighbors, and the redrawing of the maps of the world, the map of the world in such a way that peoples of the world are entitled to their own nation, their own flag, and their own sense of national pride and patriotism, by eliminating as much as possible situations where one people governs another people. It is very obvious that if the nations of the world bought into this and agreed to it, and if the League of Nations was indeed powerful enough to enforce it, then Wilson's prediction that this would be the war to end all wars would be realistic. There wouldn't be the possibility of another war coming out of this if Wilson's plan worked. So I think that's particularly significant for us to realize. There's something else to realize here. It is very obvious that if the rest of the world bought into this plan, the United States of America would control the world. Because the operative assumption here, the assumption that drove the open door, is that in an open, competitive, unrestricted commercial environment, the United States of America has the industrial capability and the wealth and the resources to dominate the world. In a fair competition, nobody can outproduce us. Nobody can undersell us. In agreeing to this, the operative reality is that the United States of America is asking the world to buy into a world which is permanently controlled by the United States of America. If you think about it, it's incredibly arrogant. It is incredibly self-centered. It is incredibly self-serving. Because the basic premise which underlies all of this is that the entire world and all the peoples of the world will be benefited by living exactly like us. By using the United States of America as their example, as the way to run an economy, as the way to set up a political system, as the way to make decisions, as the way to educate children, as the way to to educate a culture, as the way to develop a nation. The assumptions which drive this program are that the rest of the world will be better off if it's willing to remodel itself in our image. This is the model for nation building. This is the model that Jeremy Surrey points out in his book, Liberty's Surest Guardian. This is the model that American foreign policy operatives take overseas and lay on the table before competitor nations. It is based on the assumption, it's not dishonest, it's based on a realistic belief that the peoples of the world will be benefited if they do this. Now, the reality is, of course, that we'll be benefited most of all. But is there anything wrong with that? If everybody benefits, if this program raises all boats, what's wrong with that? William Appleman Williams, in his book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, locates the tragedy right here. His position is that the United States of America has the greatest opportunity in the history of the world to reform the world and uplift all the peoples in it in ways that promise to eliminate poverty, to create opportunity, to bring nutrition and quality health care and education and religious truth to all the peoples of the world, and that they will be benefited by it. William Appleman Williams believes that the United States of America has the greatest opportunity, the greatest potential in the history of the entire world to make the world better. But instead of this being an incredible opportunity, it turns out to be what Williams calls one of the world's greatest tragedies. Because in doing this, we refuse to accept the right of any of these peoples to participate in the decisions which affect them the most. We approach the world from a position of idealism and arrogance that also is unprecedented in the history of the world. We tend to conclude that anybody who doesn't agree with this is uncivilized, is barbarian, is not qualified to even have an opinion. In other words, the basic operative assumption here is if you disagree with this, it's because you're too stupid to know what's good for you. What's missing here is a realistic sense of interhuman interaction built and based upon the respect of other people. Instead of this becoming a mechanism which can potentially benefit everybody, we tend to approach this from the ugly American perspective of, we know what's best for you better than you do. And so if you try to do anything to stop this, we have not only the right, we have the obligation to crush you. In other words, we are not giving you the opportunity to reject this. What we are giving you is the opportunity to recognize the value of the product that we are bringing to you. We'll pursue this conclusion tomorrow in our program because we're very close. We're within 2 minutes of the end of our program. Actually, we're within 3 minutes. We've got a little bit longer left than I thought. What William Appleman Williams points out in his Tragedy of American Diplomacy is that here in this one program, we have encapsulated both the greatest opportunity in the history of the world to make the world better and the ingredients of a sense of arrogance and elitism which causes the whole thing to fall apart. We all know that the United States itself refused to join the League of Nations. We were the only nation that came out of World War I better than we went into it. It was not fought here. Our buildings weren't blown up. Our streets were not running with the blood of humans, of soldiers. Europe's was. That meant that most of the nations that we went into the war considering to be our competitors turn out to be nations that are totally dependent on us for restoring their economies, their societies, and their viability. We had the greatest opportunity. This is American exceptionalism. This is where we had the most exceptional opportunity in the history of the world to eliminate poverty and to bring to people who didn't have it and never had a chance of having it. And we blew it. Instead, what we ended up being, what we ended up making is enemies who began to resent us. They took what we offered. They were willing to cut deals with us. But realistically, at the same time, they resented the hell out of us. We were insensitive. And so, in a sense, instead of finding the best minds to undertake the details and the ingredients of America's foreign policy, apparently we entrusted these decisions to some of the worst minds. And we've been paying the price ever since. It's 59 minutes after the hour, and I know Bob Kincaid is firing up for his program. We'll be back together again tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. For Bob Kincaid, for the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility, I'm Bill O'Brien. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe. We'll get back together again tomorrow. Thank you.